There's a specific kind of person who, when their phone rings, feels something they're almost too ashamed to name. Not dread, exactly, not dislike for the person on the other end, just this quiet, almost involuntary pulling back, like a tide that retreats not because something scared it, but because that is simply what tides do. And if you are that person, the one who exhales when the plans fall apart, who drives home from gatherings already counting down to the moment the door closes behind you and the silence finally settles like a blanket over everything, then I want to start here with this. You are not broken. You are not cold. You are not missing something that everyone else was born with. You are just built differently, and the world has never been particularly kind about that particular kind of different. We live inside a culture that has a very specific story about what healthy looks like. Healthy is active. Healthy is warm and available, surrounded, connected, invited. Healthy picks up the phone. Healthy shows up. And somewhere inside that story, tucked in quietly like a clause no one reads aloud, is the unspoken rule that if you prefer your own company, genuinely, consistently, not as a fallback, but as a first choice, then something must have gone wrong somewhere. A wound, a wall, a childhood that left you afraid of the very closeness you secretly want. And the insidious thing about that story is how many people who prefer solitude have absorbed it so completely they spend years treating themselves like a problem they haven't solved yet. But what if the premise was wrong from the beginning? What if the preference for solitude isn't the symptom of something, but the signature of someone? Let me tell you about a man I'll call Daniel. Daniel is 34, works in software, has a small group of people he genuinely loves. He's not someone who has ever struggled to hold a conversation or make a room laugh. He's warm, present, funny in the particular way of people who observe everything before they speak. But Daniel has spent the better part of his adult life managing a kind of private shame that he's never quite found the words for. The shame of the Saturday afternoon he spent entirely alone and felt, inexplicably, embarrassingly, like it was the best day he'd had in months. The shame of the holiday party he left early, not because anything went wrong, but because something inside him had simply reached its limit, the way a cup reaches its limit, quietly, from the inside, with no drama at all. He's never told anyone that, because telling people that you sometimes prefer your own company over theirs, even when you love them, is one of those confessions that tends to land wrong. People smile and say they understand, and then they say it a little less when they're planning the next thing. The problem was never Daniel. The problem is that we never gave people like Daniel a real language for what they actually experience. We gave them diagnoses: introversion, social anxiety, avoidant attachment, and sometimes those apply. But sometimes a label taken from a clinical context becomes a cage that a person starts to decorate and live inside because it feels better than having no explanation at all. And what gets lost in that process is the distinction between pathology and temperament, between what is wounded and what is simply wired. Elaine Aron's research on the highly sensitive person, work that first emerged in the 1990s and still has not fully penetrated mainstream psychology, found that roughly 15 to 20% of people have nervous systems that process sensory and emotional information more deeply, not more dramatically, deeply. The distinction is crucial. These are not people who are fragile or reactive. These are people whose neural architecture is doing substantially more work per unit of experience than the average person's. Every conversation carries more data. Every room holds more noise, more subtext, more subtle shifts in tone and energy that land and register and have to be processed. And when you are doing that much internal work, you don't just need rest, you need solitude the way a computer needs to run its updates. Not as a luxury, not as indulgence, but as a basic functional requirement. And here is what no one told Daniel, and probably no one told you. That need is not a deficit. It is not a gap. It is not proof that you are less capable of connection than the person who seems to run on social contact like a solar panel runs on sun. It is just a different energy economy, one that our culture does not recognize, because our culture was largely built by and for the other kind. Think about how early this starts. Think about the classroom where the quiet child is called on specifically because they're quiet, as though silence is always a problem to be solved. Think about the report cards that said participates well in group activities as a metric of social health, as though the child who preferred reading at recess was missing something rather than finding something. Think about the family dinner table where "you're so quiet tonight" is delivered with a note of concern, as though your silence is a symptom that needs addressing rather than a state you're allowed to simply inhabit. We start measuring children against an extroverted standard before they are old enough to know that a standard even exists. And the children who don't fit it don't usually push back. They internalize. They learn to perform the version of themselves that the room is looking for, and they get very, very good at it. That performance has a cost, and it doesn't invoice you all at once. It works more like water on stone, slowly, imperceptibly, over so much time that you stop noticing the erosion until one day you reach for a sense of yourself and find that the edges have gone soft and indistinct. Psychologists sometimes call this the false self, not in the pathological, clinical sense necessarily, but in the quieter sense of the self that has been shaped by accommodation. The self that learned which version of you to bring to which room, and gradually, almost without meaning to, forgot to ask which version was actually yours. There's a particular kind of exhaustion that comes from this. Not the exhaustion of hard work or long hours, something flatter and more pervasive than that. It sits in your chest on Sunday evenings. It makes you stare at your phone and feel nothing toward the notifications. It makes you say yes to things and feel a small, mean-spirited resentment toward yourself for having said yes again. And it is very easy to attribute this feeling to stress, to being busy, to the general weight of adult life, to almost anything other than the actual source, which is this: you have been running a version of yourself that requires more energy than you actually have for longer than anyone around you knows. What's interesting, and this is where the psychology gets genuinely strange, is that the people who most need solitude are often the ones least likely to take it without guilt. Because the highly sensitive, the deeply empathetic, the people whose nervous systems register everything, these are also often the people most attuned to the needs of others. They feel the disappointment in the room when they decline. They carry the canceled plan like a small debt. They are, by their very nature, the people most likely to override their own needs in service of everyone else's comfort. And so they keep showing up. They keep filling the silences. They keep being present in the way that looks like health from the outside, while something quieter inside them is running lower and lower, like a signal, slowly losing bars. And here is the thing that I think most psychology content gets wrong about this, the thing that is worth sitting with. This isn't just about introversion or sensitivity. This is about what happens to a person when their natural way of being in the world gets treated consistently from a very young age as something to be corrected. Because when a fundamental preference is treated as a flaw long enough, you don't just change the behavior, you change the relationship to the self. You start to experience your own needs as inconvenient, your own quietness as suspicious, your own desire for stillness as evidence of something you should probably work on. And somewhere in that process, solitude stops being something you choose and starts being something you hide, something you take in stolen hours and feel vaguely ashamed of afterward, the way someone might feel ashamed of an indulgence they couldn't justify to the people around them. What if choosing solitude was never indulgence at all? What if it was, always, underneath all of that performance, something much closer to survival? Not the survival in the dramatic sense, not the survival of someone escaping something, but the quieter, more honest kind. The survival of a person who learned long before they had the vocabulary for it that they needed certain conditions to remain themselves, and that without those conditions, something essential slowly dims. Not disappears, dims. The way a candle doesn't go out in a draft, it just becomes less itself, smaller, more uncertain, bending toward whatever direction the wind decides. The consequences of ignoring that are not loud. They don't arrive as breakdowns or crises. They arrive as a vague flatness on Monday mornings, as friendships that feel loving but draining in equal measure, as a creeping suspicion that you are always slightly performing, even in rooms where no performance should be necessary. As the strange grief of realizing you've spent years being present everywhere except, quietly, within yourself. And this is the shift that matters. Not from isolation to connection, not from quiet to noise, but from shame to understanding. The moment you stop treating your need for solitude as a flaw to manage and start treating it as information to honor, something reorganizes. Not dramatically, but permanently. Because when you finally stop apologizing for the way your nervous system works, you get something back. Not energy exactly, something older than energy. A sense of authorship over your own life. The feeling of living inside your days rather than just moving through them. You don't have to become someone who craves crowds. You don't have to perform wellness in the extroverted shake the world keeps handing you. You just have to stop abandoning yourself in the small, daily ways. The yes when you meant no. The phone call you took when your cup was already empty. The weekend you filled because stillness felt too suspicious to defend. Tend to your solitude the way you'd tend to anything real. Not as escape, as return. If something in this felt less like new information and more like something you already knew but hadn't been given permission to say out loud, you're not alone in that. There's an entire quiet world of people who think deeply, feel fully, and simply need more stillness than the loudest version of life allows for. This channel exists for exactly those people. If that's you, subscribe. There's more here that was made with you in mind.